Renowned genetic genealogist CeCe Moore has untangled the threads of over 300 seemingly unsolvable mysteries. Now, she casts her analytical eye upon the baffling disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, convinced that the cutting-edge science of investigative DNA will ultimately shatter the wall of secrecy surrounding the investigation. But as darkness falls on this narrative, the entire paradigm shifts. For months, the public consciousness has been haunted by a single, chilling visual associated with Nancy Guthrie vanishing into the ether. Surveillance cameras captured a faceless phantom navigating the shadows, a masked entity moving with calculated precision, seemingly driven by a singular, sinister purpose. For an agonizingly long period, that singular specter dictated the entire scope of the investigation. It molded the media narrative, stoked the collective paranoia of a community, and funneled every ounce of speculation into one repetitive inquiry: who was the stranger concealed behind the disguise? Yet, a far more unsettling proposition lingers. What if we have been asking the wrong question all along? What if the key to unlocking this enigma lies not with a nameless prowler captured on lens, but rather among the individuals who occupied Nancy's inner circle? The most profound betrayal might not have breached the walls from the outside, but festered deep within the domestic sanctuary. The narrative we are unraveling now transcends the simplistic framework of a random home invasion. We are descending into a psychological labyrinth that is infinitely more chilling. We must confront the grim reality that the disjointed timeline, the deafening absences of explanation, and the carefully chosen rhetoric of Savannah might be steering us toward an abyss the public is ill-equipped to gaze into. That trajectory veers away from the unknown and strikes uncomfortably close to home, casting a heavy shadow of scrutiny over both Annie and Tommaso. At this precise juncture, the tale evolves far beyond a standard whodunit revolving around a phantom lurking on a front porch. It metamorphoses into an intricate puzzle of intimate access, suspicious timing, unspoken familial terrors, and hidden knowledge that festered long before that disguised silhouette ever materialized on the security feed. Once the superficial layers of the official narrative are methodically peeled back, a darker truth threatens to emerge. When we divert our gaze from the sensationalized intruder and focus instead on the immediate confidants hovering around Nancy during those critical, vanishing hours, the architecture of the crime radically transforms. The sequence of events suddenly adopts a sinister, highly orchestrated rhythm. The lack of outspoken advocacy morphs into a calculated quiet, and the linguistic choices employed by Savannah take on an entirely different psychological weight. The subtle evolution of her vocabulary, the peculiar details she chose to highlight, and the glaring omissions in her public pleas begin to echo less as the agonizing cries of a mourning relative. Instead, they resonate as the guarded speech of someone precariously balancing on the precipice of a reality too devastating and perilous to vocalize. Or perhaps, a truth too fractured to articulate. This deep dive initiates its inquiry right at that fracture line, eschewing premature convictions for a fundamental paradigm shift. A pivot that compels us to critically evaluate whether the faceless assailant was merely a terrifying distraction from the genuine horror. We are forced to wonder if the underlying truth has always hinged upon an insider whose intimate knowledge paved the way for that catastrophic night. Therefore, as we traverse this grim landscape, anchor your thoughts on one critical query. If Savannah's internal compass truly began pointing toward a domestic betrayal far too horrifying for polite society to process, what unspoken horrors was she witnessing firsthand while the rest of the world was fed carefully curated, fragmented lies? Injecting that variable into the equation shatters the accepted reality of the investigation. The phantom on the porch remains a vital piece of the puzzle, undoubtedly. Yet, the claustrophobic familial orbit enclosing Nancy in her twilight hours demands equal, if not greater, scrutiny. The suspicious voids in communication, the hyper-specific chronology of events, and the meticulously constructed facades presented to the media all carry the heavy scent of deception. As we meticulously tug at these fraying edges of the official narrative, two distinct, divergent pathways materialize from the gloom. The first pathway illuminates Savannah, suggesting that her most profound, private terrors were never actually aimed at a nameless drifter in the night. The second pathway leads directly to Tommaso, highlighting a web of unrestricted access physical proximity, and a chronological alignment that feels exponentially more damning upon closer inspection. Two parallel trajectories dissecting a single household, surrounding one inexplicable vanishing, and leading toward a conclusion that plunges an already morbid case into absolute darkness. The ultimate revelation might be that the true monster is not the disguised anomaly caught on tape, but the chilling premeditation and silent complicity that predated his arrival. If you have chosen to embark on this psychological descent, steel yourself for the duration of the journey. Because as the superficial facts strip away, the illusion of an unpredictable, chaotic break-in completely disintegrates. In its place rises a deeply unsettling narrative, engineered by intimate privilege, cloaked in anomalous behaviors, and rooted in a toxic bloodline dynamic that remains largely obscured from the public eye. Our forensic dissection must begin with the catalyst that shatters the familial facade. What could possibly drive Savannah to cast an accusatory gaze upon her own sister? To comprehend the genesis of such a corrosive doubt, we must retrace our steps to the very beginning. We return to the sanitized narrative initially fed to the masses. An 84-year-old matriarch vanishes into thin air from her Tucson residence during the dead of night on the 1st of February, with law enforcement declaring her the victim of an involuntary abduction. Forensic analysis confirmed that the crimson stains pooling on the threshold belonged to Nancy Guthrie. Upon the extraction of security camera data, the world was introduced to the terrifying iconography that would hijack the investigation, a disguised, weaponized silhouette looming at the entryway. Federal behavioral analysts categorized the suspect as a male, standing approximately 5'9" to 5'10", possessing a nondescript physique, his hands concealed in gloves, and burdened by a black Ozark Trail rucksack. The visceral horror provoked by that grainy snapshot was entirely justified. It offered up a neatly packaged nightmare, an identifiable antagonist, a straightforward trajectory, an anonymous predator lurking in the blackness who supposedly breached the perimeter, executed a methodical strike, and evaporated without a trace. The human mind is incredibly eager to anchor itself to such clear-cut, cinematic archetypes of evil. The narrative feels neatly contained, lacking a conclusion, perhaps, but structurally sound. You study the digital artifact, you stare at the obscured face, and your instincts instinctively scream that you are looking at the singular architect of the crime. There lies the accepted narrative. Unmask the phantom on the footage, and the entire mystery unravels. Yet, the darkest investigations are seldom so remarkably straightforward. The peril of a haunting, singular image is its power to construct a tunnel vision that blinds the public consciousness. It forces onlookers to fixate so intensely on the figure caught on tape that a secondary, far more insidious question simply fades into the background. What led that shadow to strike at that exact, precise moment? This is the chilling pivot our investigation must now take. We are not discarding the intruder in the mask. His existence remains a critical, undeniable piece of the puzzle. Rather, we are turning our gaze toward a parallel specter that holds equal weight, the grim probability of intimate, guarded intelligence. In a vanishing this orchestrated, detectives must look past the visual evidence. They are forced to ask, who possessed the schedule of Nancy? Who could predict the precise moment her home would fall completely silent? Who held a deep enough understanding of the estate to map the perfect approach? Who was aware of the surveillance blind spots, knowing exactly what digital eyes to rip out, blind, or sidestep? Who recognized her physical frailty, her advancing age, and the dangerously narrow gap of hours before her absence would finally trigger alarms? Posing these inquiries does not automatically condemn a relative. It does not instantly forge a sprawling conspiracy. Furthermore, it certainly does not rule out the presence of an unknown drifter. However, it radically fractures the foundational architecture of the investigation. You are compelled to view this tragedy less as a random kidnapping and far more as a meticulously calculated exploitation of secrets. The moment you shift that paradigm, seemingly mundane details acquire a crushing, suffocating weight. Let us begin with the primary anomaly. The final confirmed sighting of Nancy occurred on January 31st, following a family dinner, when her son-in-law, Tommaso, delivered her back to her empty residence alongside Annie. This is no whispered neighborhood gossip. It is a concrete, foundational pillar of the official timeline cemented by law enforcement. In strict isolation, a simple ride home holds absolutely no malicious intent. Yet within the bleak realm of vanishings, the ultimate point of contact is paramount. It serves as the fragile, defining bridge between a mundane evening and the abyss of the unknown. It isolates the singular individual who stood as the final witness to the victim in a state of safety. This handoff allows detectives to map the window of maximum vulnerability, the chilling stretch of time where the target was isolated, utterly exposed, and without a lifeline. Here is where the narrative descends into deeply uncomfortable territory. When attempting to decipher if the intruder was a random predator or a calculated operative, the final exchange is critical, the drop-off, the exact minutes ticking by. It all carries immense psychological weight. The precise, irrevocable second that Nancy transitioned from the security of her kin to the echoing silence of her home is profoundly significant. Digging into this moment is not an inherent indictment of the final relative who saw her. It is simply the anchor point where any seasoned, cold-blooded detective is trained to begin the hunt. Adding layers to an already labyrinthine mystery, the outward behavior of the authorities began painting two contradictory, jarring realities simultaneously. First, Sheriff Chris Nanos would eventually step before microphones to explicitly state that the Guthrie clan siblings and their partners alike were formally absolved of suspicion. He publicly condemned the swirling rumors as vicious. However, in stark contrast, police units were simultaneously caught canvassing the streets surrounding the home of Annie and Tommaso, aggressively hunting for residential camera feeds. The heavy footprint of detectives combing through that specific district was etched into the public consciousness almost immediately after the vanishing. Witnesses actively documented uniformed personnel descending upon the immediate vicinity of the property belonging to Annie and Tommaso on February 7th. A mere 3 days later, on February 10th, the badges returned, knocking on doors and extracting more digital memory from the surrounding neighborhood. This underlying friction is paramount. The community was fed a comforting narrative of innocent, grieving relatives, yet their own eyes processed a much darker procedural reality. Clearly, the task force possessed underlying motives to meticulously scour, map, and trace the geographical orbit directly tethered to the inner family circle. When official statements clash so violently with physical police actions, a heavy fog of public paranoia inevitably rolls in. This is not to imply that a neighborhood grid search equates to an admission of guilt. It inherently does not. Rather, it betrays the fact that, behind closed precinct doors, the investigation was a tangled, murky web, completely divorced from the neat conclusions the public desperately craved. Here is where the figure of Savannah weaves into the narrative with haunting complexity, not as a beacon of outright suspicion, nor as a sibling openly throwing her own sister to the wolves. Let it be clearly stated, no documented record exists of Savannah pointing a direct, accusatory finger at Annie, and maintaining that boundary is absolutely vital. Yet, our exploration dives into far deeper psychological waters, an unspoken behavioral shift that whispers secrets far louder than any formal allegation could manage. We are tracing the chilling possibility that her outward facade mutated in the very same shadows as the grim investigation itself. In the initial hours, the familial broadcasts were desperate, vibrating with the frantic energy of a rescue mission, screaming into the darkness as if Nancy were still breathing on the other side. They directed their pleas squarely at the phantom who had stolen her away. Then came the turning point. On February 24th, Savannah unveiled a staggering $1 million bounty to bring Nancy home, yet laced the announcement with a devastating public concession that her mother might already be dead. This agonizing cocktail of desperate hope and fatalistic dread, the collision of rescue terminology with the grim lexicon of a morgue, marks a profound psychological pivot. After all, vocabulary only darkens when a person's underlying reality shatters. Occasionally, such a stark transition is born from the harrowing, hushed truths shared in closed-door police briefings. Other times, it is simply the slow, crushing surrender to absolute psychological burnout. Sometimes, the first chilling realization dawns when you understand the official narrative merely obscures a darker truth. As observers meticulously dissected Savannah's public statements, a haunting question emerged. Was the raw emotion genuine, pleading into the void? Or was it the sound of a woman quietly grasping that the monster lurked far closer than initially imagined? We are not drawing definitive conclusions yet. Rather, this marks the genesis of a disturbing pattern, a psychological thread that turns sinister when returning to the masked intruder with a critical, overlooked question. Did this phantom navigate the shadows like a lost trespasser, or with the eerie precision of someone intimately acquainted with the property? That single inquiry pulls the investigation into a chilling new direction, primarily because the security footage presents a maddeningly dual-sided narrative. From one perspective, the solitary figure exhibits terrifying control, devoid of panic, and refusing to carelessly barrel into the unknown. Federal agents confirmed the suspect was completely concealed, his face obscured, hands gloved, and visibly armed. He gripped a black Ozark Trail rucksack, materializing like a ghost upon Nancy's doorstep during the bleak, pre-dawn hours of February 1st. Law enforcement eventually disseminated further visual evidence, operating under the grim hypothesis that this nameless phantom held the key to her vanishing. Anyone subjecting themselves to that harrowing tape inevitably arrives at one unsettling thought. This predator possessed a seasoned, calculating aura. Such a visceral reaction is entirely justified. Every step drips with intention, while his precise timing suggests a deeply orchestrated agenda. His methodical advance lacks the chaotic energy of a desperate opportunist. Instead, it radiates the quiet menace of an executioner armed with a blueprint. However, investigative discipline remains absolutely crucial here, especially considering the local sheriff vehemently dismantled one rampant internet theory surrounding those recordings. Sheriff Chris Nanos explicitly stated that zero empirical evidence existed, suggesting this particular shadow had been digitally captured, stalking the premises previously. Despite feverish online true crime communities rapidly adopting the concept of prior scouting visits at Nancy's residence as indisputable gospel, clarifying that specific detail is paramount. Therefore, the intellectually honest approach requires abandoning the assumption of previous physical trespassing. We simply possess no proof. The far more chilling inquiry becomes, did his demeanor betray a predator operating with unparalleled confidence, impeccable timing, and sinister preparation? Does that profound level of intimate knowledge, whether acquired firsthand or quietly fed to him, suddenly transform into the most terrifying pillar of this mystery? Posing that alternative theory alters the entire landscape, forcefully dragging the investigative lens away from the random streets and pointing it directly inside the victim's circle. Within the psychology of a residential kidnapping, possessing an intimate understanding of a home does not inherently require the perpetrator to have physically lurked upon that exact porch. A deadly familiarity can be synthesized through entirely invisible means. It can be cultivated via whispered intelligence, the meticulous tracking of daily habits, or a highly detailed, second-hand blueprint of the estate. It festers in knowing a target's precise location at a given hour, coupled with a cruel understanding of their deepest defensive blind spots, calculating exactly how long the victim would remain undiscovered, and pinpointing which environmental elements offered tactical advantages. This is why the prospect of insider involvement shatters the original narrative. Should we accept that the masked figure was devoid of improvisation, we must confront the probability that an unseen accomplice meticulously paved his way. Someone who actively engineered the environment to guarantee flawless execution. And the moment you allow that terrifying concept to take root, even merely as a theory, the true crime narrative irrevocably shifts. It ceases being a tale of a lone bogeyman, mutating instead into a sprawling, interconnected web of complicity. A clandestine network built on shared secrets, synchronized schedules, and covertly granted access. Alarmingly, every link in that dark chain invariably loops straight back to those hovering closest to Nancy before she evaporated, which inevitably propels our investigation into a highly volatile, rapidly escalating phase of the mystery. It was at this precise intersection that soothing statements fed to the media forcefully collided with the aggressive reality of the detective's actual groundwork. Even as spokespersons deliberately shielded the relatives from public suspicion, relentless law enforcement machinery kept gravitating back toward the gravitational pull of Annie and Tommaso. Eyewitnesses quietly noted that on February 7th, a distinct police presence materialized, deeply canvassing the very streets where Annie and Tommaso resided. A mere 3 days later, on February 10th, those plainclothes detectives resurfaced, actively interrogating locals and aggressively hunting for any stray residential security captures. Concurrently, specialized forensic units descended upon Nancy's property to formally seize her automobile, meticulously extracting her personal recording devices for their digital dragnet. Freeze the timeline for a brief moment, because this exact behavioral anomaly is when seasoned observers begin to sense the official storyline fracturing beneath their feet. Naturally, this specific breed of aggressive policing does not automatically equate to a definitive presumption of culpability. We must remain exceptionally objective. Questioning the neighbors is light years away from a formal indictment, and executing a search is a far cry from a guilty verdict. The rigorous gathering of trace data often fuels speculative avenues that ultimately dissolve into dead ends. Professional detectives simply allow the chronological breadcrumbs to dictate their path. Exceptional investigative work fundamentally requires this level of exhaustive thoroughness. Nevertheless, the optics of these maneuvers struck a powerful, undeniable chord with outside observers. The masses were spoon-fed rhetoric designed to exonerate the inner circle, yet their own eyes witnessed authorities relentlessly probing the perimeter of those holding the final keys to her world. Such a glaring paradox is important not because it hands us a neat solution, but because it whispers a darker truth. The hunt was violently active beneath the surface, exploring shadows the public was never meant to witness. Whenever an inquiry simmers with that kind of suppressed, covert intensity, the intricate psychological webbing between blood relatives suddenly takes center stage. The focus dramatically shifts past mere physical alibis, scrutinizing instead the subtle inflections in their voices, how they strategically retreated, their calculated physical positioning, and ultimately observing exactly who was elected to speak for the silent. The question lingers: who chose to silence their own voice? As suspicion bathed the inner circle, a stark contrast emerged. Who kept begging for help, and who quietly slipped into the shadows? Here, Annie's profound quietness weaves into this dark narrative. Remember, however, that mere silence never equates to concrete guilt. Individuals retreat inward for countless benign reasons: paralyzing terror, profound mourning, strict counsel, deep trauma, or the desperate hope to prevent further damage. Yet, choosing silence is a deliberate behavior, one drawing intense scrutiny when it sharply deviates from the surrounding chaos. Savannah, conversely, refused to vanish. She relentlessly spoke out, desperately anchoring the world's gaze onto the chilling mystery surrounding her mother. To the watching world, she morphed into the beating, grieving heart of the ordeal. In chilling contrast, Annie practically evaporated from the public eye. This glaring dichotomy amplified the whispers as detectives circled closer to their shared home, prompting observers to dissect Savannah's utterances forensically. This hyper-analysis wasn't born from open accusations toward her sister, for she never spoke a word of blame. Rather, when one sibling embodies tragedy while the other disappears, the visible sister's statements are suddenly burdened with profound, heavy significance. Observers interrogate every broken sentence, treating tearful hesitations and the slightest voice fluctuation as breadcrumbs leading toward the dark truth. This amplifies deeply as the investigation's very foundation begins to warp and mutate beneath her feet. Keep in mind, during those agonizing early days, the family operated under the frantic psychology of a rescue mission, radiating sheer terror and urgent demands. Law enforcement actively untangled shadowy communications, hinting at demands for financial payoffs. Consequently, the relatives' spoken words perfectly mirrored that torturous purgatory, a suffocating void where survival hopes clash violently against impending doom. Then, the narrative underwent a subtle mutation. It wasn't a sudden pivot, nor something easily captured in a solitary soundbite. The shift was insidious, mirroring how speech alters when someone silently processes a devastating reality lacking definitive proof. Approaching late February, Savannah's public pleas subtly morphed to concede a much darker outcome. She braced for the grim reality of Nancy's death, a tragic concession made even while raising the bounty and begging for tips. By this tragic juncture, the financial incentive for answers had swelled beyond $200,000. Subsequent media dispatches revealed that combined funds from federal agents, relatives, and supportive organizations had ballooned even further. This rhetorical evolution is critical. Acknowledging death strikes the ear differently than initial, frantic cries for a safe return. They carry a heavier, colder resonance from a darker psychological depth, marking the exact moment pure sorrow overtakes desperate optimism. Conversely, it can signify mourning triggered by chilling, behind-the-scenes revelations the outside world isn't yet permitted to know. This hardly confirms Savannah possessed the culprit's identity or harbored concrete suspicions against Annie. However, it undeniably proves the tragedy's psychological atmosphere had darkened. When such an emotional pivot occurs amidst ticking clocks, a disguised phantom, and the sinister question of final family contact, coupled with relentless suburban door-knocking and unsettling doubts regarding the assailant's inside knowledge, observers inevitably gravitate toward darker inquiries. Was Savannah genuinely just voicing the raw agony of a missing mother's child? Or was she cautiously attempting to survive a horrifying reality creeping dangerously close to her own front door? As the investigation unraveled, the boundary between a random predator and trusted kin blurred, revealing a much more terrifying, fundamental fracture. The core mystery evolved: who was genuinely shocked by Nancy vanishing into thin air? And who secretly lingered far too close to the devastating truth while hiding behind a veil of public ignorance? The moment that chilling theory breaches the narrative, a singular piece of physical evidence eclipses nearly every other detail. Not the front steps, the security lens, or even the discarded handwear discovered later. It is the automobile. Once detectives shift their gaze towards sinister logistics of motion and relocation, mere transportation transforms into a vital, incriminating link. In this specific nightmare, that mechanical link holds terrifying potential to bridge the final confirmed domestic interaction with the unspeakable horrors that followed. At this exact intersection, the crime ceases to be a stationary event, suddenly stretching out into a dark, calculated path. Once law enforcement accepts the premise of a forced abduction from the sanctuary, their tunnel vision expands far beyond the threshold and the faceless tape recording. They frantically search for the vessel, connecting the final seconds of a woman's ordinary existence to the pitch-black void following her kidnapping. Investigators aggressively hunt for moments of transit. They scrutinize unaccounted minutes, obsessively hunting for any detail logically spanning the agonizing distance between that final domestic encounter and her total erasure. Amidst this sprawling mystery, a solitary item began projecting exactly that kind of grim significance: the family car. Law enforcement forcibly extracted Nancy's automobile from the driveway, simultaneously dismantling the residence's digital security network to relentlessly process the scene. That single, decisive maneuver whispers volumes about the dark theories quietly taking root in the detectives' minds. Investigators refuse to look at a single piece of footage and call the mystery unraveled. Instead, detectives expanded their scope, dragging the net for transit data, electronic breadcrumbs, and any fragment of reality that might illuminate the dark hours wrapped around the 1st of February. However, we must tread lightly on these details. The available records do not definitively crown Tommaso's personal automobile as the primary piece of physical proof driving this investigation. Nothing within the verifiable documentation has ever cemented that specific theory as absolute fact. Yet, what the transparent files do reveal is a sprawling web where automobiles, security lenses, electronic footprints, and residential monitors form the very skeleton of the detective's strategy. This distinction is vital because a puzzle of this magnitude hinges entirely on invisible threads. It is rarely just about who stood in the room, but the precise mechanics of how they got there. It is about the method of their departure and the exact physical trajectory that forensic experts can stitch back together when the dust settles. Therefore, the most sober way to evaluate the situation is to acknowledge that the chronology of transit is paramount. The sequence of physical motion is absolutely everything. Why this carries such profound weight becomes instantly apparent the moment you adopt the cold, calculating mindset of a homicide detective. The final documented interaction Nancy had with her blood relatives was that evening meal, followed by the ride home with Annie and Tommaso. From that second onward, the aperture of time suffocates into an impossibly tight frame. Law enforcement eventually went on the record to declare their conviction that she was the victim of a calculated, intentional strike. Furthermore, Sheriff Chris Nanos subsequently indicated that his team possesses a clear understanding of the underlying reason for the act, even if that driving force remains locked away from the public eye. Such statements confirm that detectives never viewed this tragedy as a senseless collision of fate. They investigated it from day one as a chillingly deliberate operation. The instant a crime is classified as premeditated, the logistical chronology of how individuals traverse the map shifts from a background detail to the absolute focal point. It becomes a relentless hunt for who traveled to which location at what exact minute, cross-referencing eyewitness accounts with security footage, cellular pings, and microscopic physical residue. This is precisely why the automobile, or more accurately, the unbroken sequence of transit injects such a pervasive dread into this narrative. The vehicle practically transforms into a mute observer that holds all the secrets. This eerie feeling does not stem from any confirmed knowledge of what the evidence dictates. Rather, it arises because the authorities operated under the stark belief that salvation lay hidden within the peripheral transit surrounding the crime. The focus was never isolated to the epicenter of the tragedy alone. As that investigative philosophy took hold, the atmospheric pressure surrounding Annie and Tommaso thickened with an undeniable gravity. To be absolutely clear, this atmospheric weight does not equate to verified evidence of their culpability. No such proof exists in the public domain. To the contrary, Sheriff Nanos explicitly stepped in front of the microphones to announce that the immediate relatives were entirely ruled out as persons of interest. That official exoneration carries massive significance, and it must remain firmly anchored in our perspective if we intend to navigate this narrative with any shred of integrity. Yet, another undeniable truth shares that exact same space. Detectives continued aggressively sweeping the perimeter of those who had ultimate proximity to the victim, relentlessly harvesting data. They refused to stop dissecting the fragments, approaching the investigation as a volatile, breathing enigma that had yet to surrender its final, damning piece. For the audience observing this psychological theater from afar, the resulting friction birthed a deeply unsettling brand of paranoia. When official declarations of innocence are placed right next to a feverish, ongoing police crusade, human nature takes over. The public strips away formal allegations and begins intensely scrutinizing raw human conduct. It is within this exact psychological vacuum that Annie's profound absence of sound takes on a much darker resonance than it possessed in the opening act. This is not to suggest that a refusal to speak is an admission of sin, because it fundamentally is not. However, stark behavioral divides inherently breed interpretation. Savannah remained fiercely visible, maintaining a relentless drumbeat of pleas for public assistance and continually broadcasting the federal agency's contact numbers. She injected every ounce of her psychological energy into the crusade to recover her mother, holding the line even on the days she dared to vocalize the terrifying prospect that Nancy had already perished. Undeterred, she begged those guarding secrets to step into the light, repeatedly reminding them that information could be traded from the shadows and that financial bounties required no names attached. That, however, is an incredibly distinct and demanding way to navigate a nightmare in the public eye. It is an inherently aggressive, uncompromising, and highly exposed strategy of survival. Yet, with every impassioned word that escaped Savannah's lips, the hollow space left by Annie's deliberate retreat from the spotlight became glaringly obvious against the backdrop of the tragedy. The moment that behavioral chasm captured the collective attention, a far more insidious curiosity began to take root in the minds of the onlookers. Why would one sibling act as the burning psychological core of the rescue mission while the other faded into the background? Naturally, a multitude of benign explanations exist for such a dynamic. It could stem from opposing psychological architectures, contrasting methods of processing trauma, rigid counsel from attorneys, or simply a fundamental inability to withstand the harsh glare of the press. Every single one of those justifications holds water. But those who consume the darkest facets of human nature rarely stop at clinical facts. They are eternally hunting for behavioral rhythms. The second a distinct familial rhythm solidifies, Every syllable uttered by the sister standing in the light is instantly burdened with an excruciating, analytical pressure. This chilling reality forces us to confront perhaps the most emotionally explosive element of this entire saga, the evolving lexicon of Savannah. In the initial stages, her outward communications were built entirely around the architecture of a desperate plea. The cries were direct and urgent. Assist us. Locate her. Return her to her family. Speak up. Take action. Be the catalyst that shatters this nightmare. The financial incentive orchestrated by her relatives swelled dramatically, crossing the $200,000 mark before ultimately erupting to a staggering $1 million. Throughout that escalation, they applied relentless pressure to unearth leads that would end in either Nancy's safe return or handcuffs on a suspect. But beneath the surface, the frequency of those broadcasts began to mutate. Optimism had not entirely died, certainly. Yet it was suddenly forced to share the room with a much darker, far more ominous psychological undertone. It was a shift that no longer resembled a desperate negotiation with someone holding a hostage, but rather the grim, psychological bracing for a reality far too monstrous to outrun. Accounts surfaced, detailing the chilling moment on February 24th when Savannah stepped before the cameras to raise the family's reward. It was there she openly conceded the harrowing possibility that her mother might already be dead, a devastating admission wedged within her desperate pleas for answers. This was no subtle pivot. It represented a monumental, crushing shift in the psychological landscape of the crisis. Whenever a child alters their rhetoric so drastically in the throes of an active, ongoing kidnapping investigation, observers are inevitably forced to wonder, what triggered this dark epiphany? Was it simply the cruel passage of days, the suffocating grip of despair, or perhaps a grim reality whispered by detectives behind closed doors? Or had the sheer, suffocating mass of circumstantial horrors finally broken her? The phantom figure concealing his face, the haunting final communication, the relentless physical hunts, the methodical gathering of forensics, the sudden pivoting of police attention toward familiar streets, and the agonizing gaps in the perpetrator's timeline. These fragments may have pushed her toward a morbid conclusion long before the outside world was prepared to accept it. It is at this exact juncture that the premise of this investigation sheds any trace of hyperbole and becomes deeply disturbing. This is not because Savannah ever stood up and pointed a finger of guilt at her own sister. She absolutely did not. But the reality is that doubt rarely manifests as a loud, direct indictment. Far more often, it creeps in through a subtle darkening of tone. It surfaces when words grow meticulously measured, steeped in premature mourning, and cloaked in unspoken layers. It reveals itself when a spokesperson continues facing the flashbulbs, yet their voice betrays the crushing weight of a terrible, private burden. If that grim psychological theater was indeed playing out in front of us, then the ultimate nightmare was not merely a faceless stranger striking from the shadows. The true terror was the looming possibility that the answers lay buried within an intimate circle, hovering far nearer to Nancy than anyone dared to imagine. This inevitably pulls us down an even darker corridor of inquiry. Here, the narrative walks a razor-thin, treacherous line. As Savannah's public addresses grew increasingly burdened, the audience's ears perked up not merely for clues regarding Nancy's whereabouts, but for the subtle, lingering shadow of Annie, whose presence hovered heavily over the saga even as she retreated from the spotlight. This is the precise intersection where the mystery spirals into a complex psychological labyrinth. In investigations of this magnitude, the focus extends far beyond the victim who vanished into the ether or the figures caught on surveillance footage. It becomes intensely about who steps up to the microphone, and glaringly, who stays silent. From the very onset of the nightmare, Savannah emerged as the resolute, unwavering mouthpiece for the tragedy. By February 2nd, once authorities officially classified Nancy's vanishing as a sinister criminal act, Savannah issued a desperate declaration anchoring all hope on her mother's survival. It was a textbook embodiment of the raw panic and clinging optimism that defined the opening hours of a family's worst ordeal. It overflowed with trembling thanks, palpable desperation, and a singular, agonizing plea: bring her back safely. Yet, as the investigative vice tightened, Savannah made a crucial rhetorical shift. She persistently shielded herself behind collective phrasing. No longer was she stepping forward solely as an individual daughter. She assumed the mantle of a unified front, acting as the voice of the siblings, the inner circle, and the bloodline most intimately intertwined with Nancy. They presented an unbreakable facade to the cameras, even as the fabric of the investigation seemed to be unraveling into chaos behind closed doors. During the haunting broadcast on February 7th, Savannah positioned herself flanked by Annie and Cameron. Gripping their hands tightly, she uttered the bone-chilling sentence that continues to echo through the annals of this mystery. "We received your communication, and we comprehend your terms. We are prepared to pay." It was widely circulated that federal agents had quietly coached the siblings prior to an initial televised appeal, though officials stressed that the ultimate, desperate script remained entirely the family's choice. That specific choice of unified pronouns holds immense weight. When a single individual becomes the designated conduit for a fractured family, their role morphs into something far heavier than just begging for mercy. They become the vessel for the collective trauma, the shared paranoia, the calculated maneuvers, and, perhaps most tellingly, the unspoken secrets of the others. It is within these very gaps that Annie's invisible presence begins to loom large over the narrative. This remains true even as her own voice is conspicuously absent from the airwaves. It is a delicate nuance, yet absolutely vital to dissecting the dynamics at play. Annie did not entirely vanish from the preliminary media appeals. She sat shoulder to shoulder with Savannah and Cameron during those early tape broadcasts. Her physical form was planted firmly within the frame, cementing the illusion of a united, grieving household. As the days bled into weeks, however, Savannah cemented her role as the sole visible chronicler of their heartbreak. This stark divergence in visibility does not intrinsically equate to bad blood. It offers no concrete proof of hidden malice, nor does it inherently confirm culpability. Yet it undeniably breeds a deeply unsettling psychological friction. Annie remains an inescapable focal point on the investigative clock, a crucial fixture in the final verified moments of Nancy's known life. Her home drew intense, probing gazes from the authorities. Despite this, the burden of narrating the family's public agony continuously fell squarely upon Savannah's shoulders. Because of this stark imbalance, true crime observers began to dissect more than just Savannah's tearful updates regarding her missing mother. They zeroed in on how Annie's ghost seemed to tether itself to Savannah's appearances. It was not always through explicit name-dropping. Often, it was simply through a haunting, unspoken proximity. On occasion, it manifested in those tense, shared frames of camera time. But primarily, it was the glaring reality that Savannah continuously anchored the emotional storm, while Annie remained a stoic, impenetrable enigma on the periphery. The moment detectives secured a warrant to tear through the residence shared by Annie and Tommaso, this jarring contrast morphed into something impossible to brush aside. Eventually, Sheriff Chris Nanos would step forward to formally declare that all children and their respective partners had been ruled out as perpetrators. Yet, that exoneration was issued only after law enforcement had successfully petitioned a judge to execute a raid on Annie and Tommaso's property. Today, those two chilling realities exist permanently intertwined within the cold, hard archives of the investigation. This underlying friction is precisely what makes this chapter of the investigation so deeply disturbing. Society is essentially forced to balance two violently opposing truths at the exact same time. The first reality: the relatives are mourning victims who have been officially absolved by law enforcement. The second reality: detectives still felt compelled to execute a search warrant on the residence of the daughter and son-in-law, the very individuals positioned within the ultimate, most intimate ring of access to Nancy. When these two conflicting narratives collide, even the most cautious analysts are left questioning if Savannah was quietly trapped within that very paradox herself. Imagine the sheer psychological weight of it. Your mother has vanished into the void, and a faceless, masked figure materializes in the evidence. Demands for a payout surface. Detectives begin measuring every single syllable they utter to the press, and federal agents quietly enter the fray. You and your kin are thrust in front of news cameras, while simultaneously, the home belonging to your own flesh and blood, your sister and her husband, is subjected to a highly visible police raid. Even if you are desperately attempting to project a united front to the watching world, how could that crushing pressure not bleed into your vocabulary? How could it avoid warping the cadence of your speech, the careful construction of your sentences, or the very manner in which you desperately cling to optimism? This is exactly why we must continuously strip away the layers of Savannah's public statements. We do not scrutinize her to definitively prove she harbored suspicions about Annie, but rather because human dialogue betrays profound psychological distress far before it exposes actual truths. By the tail end of February, the underlying resonance of her public appeals had undergone a chilling transformation. When the family escalated the bounty to an astronomical $1 million, she openly confessed to the cameras that Nancy might have already taken her final breath. She maintained the facade of holding out for a miracle, pleading for any fragment of intel that might bring her mother back safely. Yet, those phrases no longer echoed the hollow ring of simple, naive denial. These were the calculated syllables of a woman attempting to survive in two parallel universes: blind optimism warring with creeping terror, public performances masking intimate paranoia, and the illusion of blood loyalty fracturing under relentless police scrutiny. This profound psychological fracture is the very fault line running beneath the entire mystery. Once you finally recognize that subtle tear in the fabric, the core question we are unraveling suddenly snaps into a horrifying focus. It remains unproven, a ghost of an accusation. But it makes sense because profound suspicion rarely looks like a dramatic, pointed finger. Often, it manifests as hypervigilant articulation, while the very earth gives way beneath your feet. It disguises itself as a refusal to crack before the media, even as your chosen vocabulary begins to mirror an incredibly sinister, encroaching reality. It is the hollow act of continuing to use the word we, long after the individuals sharing that collective pronoun have been utterly compromised in the court of public opinion. If this psychological chess match was truly unfolding, Savannah never needed to hurl direct accusations at Annie for the world to detect the toxic undercurrent. She merely needed to keep opening her mouth, because with every passing interview, the listening audience began to perceive a chilling, dual-layered narrative. The rehearsed tragedy she delivered to the microphones, and the far darker, unspoken confession bleeding through her shifting semantics. This inevitably drags us to the next massive pivot in the investigation. Until now, the mounting dread stemmed entirely from chronological oddities, forensic sweeps, glaring sibling contrasts, and the haunting evolution of Savannah's tone. Yet inevitably, an entirely different breed of suffocating weight invades the narrative. A clinical, external authority steps in, a behavioral profiler who stares at the exact same constellation of facts and finally verbalizes the horrific question everyone else was terrified to whisper. The second those words are spoken, the trajectory of the investigation is permanently and violently altered. We arrive at the crucial intersection where raw psychological trauma crashes into a cold, calculating reality. This is no longer mere rumor, wild digital speculation, or faceless cyber sleuths spinning chaotic webs on message boards. This is clinical translation. It is the gaze of a seasoned expert, because once a mystery ferments to this level of complexity, surviving the chilling security video, enduring the property raids, weathering the tearful broadcasts, deciphering the linguistic anomalies, and witnessing the glaring paradox of active police suspicion masquerading as routine clearance. Society desperately craves an objective observer to decode what this grotesque mosaic actually depicts. The moment that external gaze falls upon the evidence, the dark tale mutates once more. Until this very crossroad, every single breadcrumb we have chased originated from the exact same finite pool of data. The established sequence of events, the grainy camera feeds, the quiet maneuvers of the task force, and the highly visible grief of those supposedly nearest to Nancy's heart. In isolation, these fragments fail to legally condemn the bloodline, but fused together, they construct a behavioral labyrinth so damning that forensic psychologists are practically begged to decipher it. Their goal is not to deliver a tidy resolution, but to expose the structural weak points where the lies are buckling, which is precisely why this juncture is so critical. The sudden arrival of a behavioral analyst, the whispering shadow of familial guilt, these elements do not materialize from thin air. They emerge the exact second an abduction ceases to resemble the random, chaotic violence of a stranger in the night. and begins to rot from the inside out, exposing a crime heavily sculpted by intimate access, insider knowledge, flawless timing, and devastating household secrets. The suspicion takes root the moment the civilian world catches the scent of the very truth detectives have been hoarding in silence. The chilling reality that in certain vanishings, the ultimate smoking gun isn't the masked phantom captured on film, but rather the unseen architect who meticulously unlocked the door for them. Let us pause for a moment. We have reached the absolute precipice of this investigation, the very center of the labyrinth we have been navigating. If the fracturing of Savannah's public composure became impossible to ignore, and if Annie's sudden retreat into the shadows only amplified the glare of suspicion, if Tommaso remained forever anchored to the last verifiable moment before Nancy was erased, and if detectives relentlessly paced the perimeter of that final, intimate circle, all while the authorities insisted, at least to the cameras, that the public must look away from the family, then what dark current was truly pulling beneath the surface? Here, the dual trajectories we have been following violently collide. The first is the threat of the sister. We are not indulging the wild theories casting Annie as the phantom in the mask, nor the dangerous assumption that a quiet demeanor equals a guilty conscience. Rather, it is the undeniable reality of her position. Annie occupied the dead center of the blast radius, positioned squarely within that last protective ring around Nancy. She stood under the harsh lights during the initial pleas for help, only to fade out of view precisely when the investigative lens swiveled toward her own doorstep. That withdrawal alone is enough to seed a deep, creeping paranoia, particularly for those analyzing every fractured syllable of Savannah's shifting rhetoric. Then there is the Tommaso element. This is not an accusation, but a cold, clinical mapping of the facts. The final window of human interaction is paramount. The precise moment of the drop-off is critical. The choreography of their movements is everything. It forces a chilling question into the light. Was the masked intruder a random predator striking blindly in the night, or a phantom whose flawless timing relied on intimate, inside intelligence? When you trace the blueprint of a targeted hit, the roadmap inevitably leads straight through the individuals who shared Nancy's final, vulnerable hours. This is the focal point of the nightmare. Because if the true source of Savannah's underlying terror was somehow tethered to her sister, it was likely never a belief that Annie's own hands committed the atrocity. It was likely a far more insidious dread, the paralyzing suspicion that Annie harbored secrets kept hidden from the world, or that she was standing perilously close to the truth, or simply that the sphere encompassing Annie and Tommaso was aligned far too perfectly with that final, fatal window of opportunity. At this exact junction, the separate threads of sister and partner intertwine into a single, terrifying rope, the devastating probability of inside knowledge. Once that underlying architecture is exposed, the true nature of this entire narrative comes into brutal focus. The investigation did not pivot toward the family because of a single, earth-shattering discovery. It turned inward because a constellation of microscopic details all began glowing with the same eerie light. Nancy's final known moments were spent sharing a meal with Annie and Tommaso. The figure in the mask moved with the calculated precision of an executioner. Detectives continued to quietly harvest evidence, perpetually circling that inner perimeter. Meanwhile, Savannah's desperate cries for a rescue gradually morphed into a complex, agonizing display of mourning intertwined with longing. And the absolute declarations of the family's innocence had to live alongside the undeniable reality of detectives treating that same inner circle like the center of gravity. Yet, shadows are not evidence. Here, absolute objectivity is required. A deeply unsettling sequence of events does not equate to a conviction before a judge and jury. Sheriff Chris Nanos has stood before the press to officially absolve the relatives from the suspect list, issuing stern warnings against the poison of reckless speculation. Simultaneously, he has openly admitted that authorities believe Nancy was hunted with intent, hinting that they already possess the underlying motive and that they continue to chase the ghosts of an investigation that refuses to be closed. These conflicting truths coexist in the same breath. We are forced to balance two entirely different realities on the edge of a knife. The first is the grim acknowledgement that the court of public opinion is a fast, vicious, and thoroughly unforgiving machine. A lack of words is not an admission of sin. Trauma wears 1,000 different masks. Those drowning in unimaginable psychological agony might articulate themselves in strange ways, retreat into their shells, and behave erratically for reasons completely detached from the burden of criminal guilt. Furthermore, the dramatic theater of search warrants and neighborhood sweeps can merely be the messy process of elimination, destined to point the compass in a completely different direction. But the second reality is impossible to shake. This tragedy has left behind a dense cluster of inquiries anchored directly to the bloodline, anomalies that no carefully crafted press briefing has ever truly managed to exorcise. The time frame of that ultimate family encounter remains a heavy anchor. The uncanny synchronization of the masked interloper cannot be ignored. The digital footprints of their movements carry weight. The shifting psychological landscape of Savannah's interviews speaks volumes. Annie's retreat into silence remains a fascinating behavioral anomaly, even if it holds no legal value as a smoking gun. And the suffocating friction between the sanitized public updates and the relentless, aggressive tactics happening behind closed doors continues to shroud this mystery in a darkness no official statement has cured. Which brings us to the most agonizing precipice of all. When we first opened this file, the anatomy of the crime appeared straightforward, albeit brutally macabre. Who was the faceless phantom standing on Nancy Guthrie's threshold? Yet, after untangling this labyrinth, that query does not exist in a vacuum. It is now haunted by a far more sinister inquiry, one steeped in intimacy, betrayal, and profound psychological horror. Did Savannah's ultimate terror gradually shift away from the nameless monster lurking in the yard to a paralyzing realization of how deeply the actual truth was buried within the walls of her own family's most guarded circle? Ultimately, this is the unsettling reality we are forced to confront as darkness falls. Nancy Guthrie remains utterly untraceable. Law enforcement insists this remains a deeply active, highly calculated, and unsolved operation, yet no concrete evidence has unmasked the shadowy figure caught on film. Likewise, the public record offers zero proof regarding what those closest to her actually knew, leaving behind a chilling constellation of glaring inconsistencies. We are haunted by the sheer precision of the timing, the ease of access, the digital footprint, the deafening quiet, and the subtle shifts in rhetoric. Above all, a terrifying theory lingers that the phantom caught on surveillance was merely a single link in a much larger, darker chain of complicity. Perhaps the ultimate mystery extends far beyond whether this disguised intruder was operating as a lone wolf. The true question, the one that makes this entire narrative so deeply uncomfortable to stomach, might be that the most horrifying piece of the puzzle was never the disguise at all. Rather, it is the chilling prospect that an individual from Nancy's inner circle possessed secrets that were deliberately withheld from the public eye. Let us venture down that dark path, refusing to pretend the puzzle is complete, and instead lingering in the uncomfortable void of the unknown. What makes the vanishing of Nancy Guthrie so profoundly disturbing is that detectives have long since abandoned the realm of innocent explanations. We are well past the point where anyone can write this off as a tragic misunderstanding, a mere stroke of bad luck, or a meaningless anomaly on a security tape. By March 13, 2026, Sheriff Chris Nanos confirmed a grim reality. Authorities are convinced Nancy was the victim of a calculated, deliberate hunt. Detectives claim to have untangled the underlying motive and continue to relentlessly pursue leads, yet they have remarkably refrained from naming an official suspect. Furthermore, Nanos disclosed that complex genetic material salvaged from the crime scene is under intense scrutiny, warning that the perpetrator remains a severe, recurring threat to the community. This revelation is critical. It fundamentally alters the psychological atmosphere surrounding every single detail we have examined thus far. Law enforcement is unequivocally not handling this disappearance as a benign slip-up or wandering mind. They outright reject the theory of a random crime of opportunity, and despite harboring working hypotheses, they refuse to act as though the core mysteries have been quietly resolved behind closed doors. The sheriff's decree is clear. Those investigating the case are certain Nancy was placed in the crosshairs with clear intent. They suspect they know exactly why she was taken, and are aggressively hunting down potential conspirators while chasing complex digital footprints. Among these technical leads are bizarre, localized internet outages reported across her neighborhood on the very night she vanished into thin air. Consider the heavy implications this casts upon her relatives, because the moment detectives use the word targeted, the perimeter of suspicion inherently shrinks. This tightening does not automatically imply the bloodline is guilty, but it absolutely shines a spotlight on their shared secrets and daily patterns. It zeroes in on who held the keys to her life, evaluating their physical closeness to Nancy during her final, documented moments of normalcy. This inherent complexity is exactly why the narrative violently rejects the neat, digestible version the public craves, a straightforward tale of an anonymous home invader snatching a vulnerable senior. The far more sinister truth is that if she was selectively hunted, the predator required an intimate, insider understanding of her daily existence to execute the flawless abduction. That chilling realization casts a long, dark shadow over every seemingly innocent piece of the timeline. Through this lens, the fact that Tommaso was the final individual known to have escorted Nancy to her residence takes on immense weight, just as Annie's presence in that intimate final circle becomes impossible to ignore. The image of forensics teams meticulously tearing through the family's mobile devices, hard drives, vehicles, and private estates becomes deeply significant. Even with the official proclamation that her loved ones were cleared, the weight of that invasive search lingers, creating a profoundly bizarre paradox when viewed as a whole. The sheriff made a point to publicly absolve her relatives of any wrongdoing, explicitly labeling them as collateral victims of this nightmare. Yet, in the very same breath, he confirmed that detectives had forcefully seized their personal electronics for rigorous digital extraction. Authorities scoured their cars and living spaces, exhausting every conceivable domestic theory before stepping back a dual approach that is far from contradictory. In truth, this is standard protocol for a high-stakes homicide division, though it inevitably leaves the observing public grappling with intense cognitive dissonance. The relatives exist outside the formal crosshairs of the law, but remain inescapably anchored at the very heart of the crime's most critical chronological window. That jarring disconnect is likely why Savannah's involvement has resonated with such a heavy, emotionally volatile frequency among those watching from afar. She has stood as the most prominent vocal pillar of the family, driving the narrative from their initial press releases straight through to the desperate television appeals and bounty updates. On March 2nd, she physically returned to the desolate crime scene, flanked by Annie and Tommaso. They were seen laying floral arrangements at a makeshift memorial, pleading with a fractured community to keep the flicker of hope alive. The visual is striking, presenting a united front to the cameras despite the crushing weight of unsolved mysteries, though external solidarity rarely masks the devastating internal fractures. It is an unseen tension that observers intuitively detect, a psychological undercurrent they can feel in their bones even without hard evidence. A close analysis of Savannah's public statements reveals a haunting evolution through very specific psychological stages. It began with the frantic begging for a safe return, morphed into language attempting to negotiate a ransom, and finally settled into a grueling blend of lingering faith and premature mourning as the financial bounty surged. Crossing from late February into early March, the privately funded bounty skyrocketed, bolstered by a $100,000 pledge from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, pushing the ultimate prize to a staggering $1 million for Nancy's retrieval or a definitive capture. When a grieving child's public rhetoric undergoes such a drastic metamorphosis during a live kidnapping investigation, the audience begins to scrutinize every syllable. This heightened scrutiny is not necessarily because every tear or tonal shift is a breadcrumb leading to the killer. Grief is a shapeshifter. Occasionally, it morphs under the crushing weight of time, but more often, it twists violently when confronted with new, unsettling information. The public remains largely in the dark as to which force is currently driving this narrative. Yet, what we can confirm is law enforcement's quiet insistence that they are inching ever closer to the truth. The scope of this investigation continues to widen, rooted in the steadfast belief among detectives that the nightmare inflicted upon Nancy was born from a very specific, chilling intent. Perhaps that calculated intent is exactly why this mystery relentlessly drags observers back to the same cluster of deeply uncomfortable questions. No single piece of evidence has served as the proverbial smoking gun. It simply has not materialized. Furthermore, the details fed to the public remain far too sparse to lock in any definitive conclusions. The picture remains fractured. Yet, a lingering unease persists. Why does the atmosphere surrounding this disappearance suggest a far deeper web of family dynamics than the official statements have dared to outline? Why does that crucial, fleeting window of final access continue to radiate such profound significance? Why does the grainy footage of the masked figure feel utterly hollow when divorced from the precise chronological events that flank his arrival? And why does Savannah's relentless advocacy occasionally come across as more than mere desperate pleading, echoing instead as the fierce defiance of someone determined to prevent this investigation from solidifying into a deceptively simple narrative? Most hauntingly, even after the inner circle was officially cleared of suspicion, why do the most agonizing, psychologically taxing questions inevitably lead right back to the exact same starting line? They lead back to the fundamental mystery. Who exactly was orbiting closest to Nancy in those final, suffocating moments before her world plunged into absolute darkness? This profound discrepancy is the hook that makes walking away from this story nearly impossible. The disguise worn by the intruder is blatantly obvious. The sequence of events surrounding him is anything but. We can easily see the unknown trespasser. What remains completely invisible, however, is the flow of inside information. And in the shadowy realm of criminal investigations, tracking who knew what is often where the genuine, terrifying truth resides. As it stands today, Nancy remains vanished without a trace, and authorities have yet to publicly identify a single prime suspect. The local sheriff insists that detectives now grasp the underlying motive for her abduction. Yet the breadcrumbs released to the press are entirely insufficient to reveal the structural foundation of that bold assertion. A complex sample of mixed genetic material serves as a lingering, tantalizing thread. Meanwhile, the relatives continue to project a fiercely unified front to the watching world. Yet, the dark cloud hovering above this entire ordeal remains the very enigma that makes it so deeply unsettling. The horror lies not merely in the identity of the figure haunting the doorstep, but in discovering who possessed the intimate knowledge required to facilitate that precise intrusion. For now, this is the bleak precipice where we must pause this chapter of the investigation. We do not pause with concrete answers, nor do we point direct fingers of blame. Instead, we are left grappling with the same sinister underlying current that has been quietly swelling since day one. The truly terrifying realization is that the most critical piece of the puzzle regarding the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie was likely never the masked intruder acting in total isolation. Rather, it is the chilling prospect that the ultimate truth lies buried within a complex web of physical access, calculated timing, and insider awareness, a web still submerged just millimeters below what the public is permitted to see. Perhaps that inherent duality forms the most agonizing, psychologically punishing aspect of this entire mystery. The torment is not strictly confined to Nancy's sudden vanishing act. It stems equally from the fact that observers are trapped staring at two simultaneous, vastly incomplete versions of reality. Through one lens, the narrative presents itself as a straightforward, albeit horrific, act of random external violence. It paints a picture of a disguised predator, a vulnerable elderly victim, a night of sheer terror, and a desperate manhunt for a stranger with no ties to the residence. Law enforcement officials assert that Nancy was abducted by force during the pre-dawn hours of February 1st, prompting federal agents to distribute chilling security footage of the masked operative lingering at her entryway. Yet, when viewing the incident through the second lens, the parameters of the crime become infinitely more difficult to emotionally compartmentalize. This friction exists because detectives have now openly stated their conviction that Nancy was the victim of a highly calculated, targeted strike, claiming they firmly grasp the underlying motivation. Consequently, they are aggressively probing the deeply unsettling possibility that the shadowed figure captured on film did not execute this operation alone. Adding to the dread, Sheriff Chris Nanos revealed that complex forensic evidence pulled from the crime scene is undergoing intense scrutiny, issuing a grim warning that the perpetrator remains fully capable of repeating such an atrocity. When these two distinct narratives are forced to overlap, the complexion of the mystery irrevocably shifts. A premeditated, targeted assault forces us to look far beyond the simple question of a culprit's name. It inevitably breeds questions of meticulous planning and sinister orchestration. It demands we ask exactly how much intelligence was gathered long before the darkness of that specific night fell. It forces us to wonder if the ghost on the security feed represents the entirety of the plot, or merely the visible tip of a much deeper, more insidious conspiracy. This very tension is exactly why the internal chronology of the relatives remains a piece of the puzzle that simply cannot be ignored. The leading investigator has been emphatic that the immediate family was subjected to an exhaustive, invasive review encompassing their digital footprints, residences, and personal vehicles before being officially cleared. Simultaneously, this level of scrutiny confirms a chilling reality. The innermost circle was deemed suspicious enough to warrant such intense digital and physical dismantling before law enforcement felt comfortable absolving them in the public eye. Consider, for a moment, the immense psychological toll such an invasive process extracts from the fragile ecosystem of a household. We are not talking about the polished optics on the evening news or sensationalized print headlines, but the raw, private devastation behind closed doors. The matriarch has vanished into thin air. A media frenzy ensues. Then comes the terrifying arrival of extortion-style demands. Federal agents descend upon the scene. Suddenly, the very people paralyzed by grief find themselves under the harsh glare of an interrogation lamp, simply because the brutal mechanics of a high-stakes investigation dictate it. Amidst all of this suffocating paranoia and procedural suspicion, those same individuals are forced to physically lock arms and present a united, unflinching facade to the world. Savannah, Annie, and Cameron executed this precise performance in the early days of February. They stood shoulder to shoulder to broadcast a desperate plea, mere moments after authorities revealed the household had been contacted by the captors. Staring into the cameras, Savannah delivered a chillingly direct message to the architects of the nightmare. The demands had been received, and the stakes were fully understood. Her declaration of their willingness to pay the ransom was far more than a simple display of raw, unfiltered emotion. It was a masterclass in projecting familial solidarity during a period when the facts were still chaotic, shifting, and shrouded in total ambiguity. It is this exact dynamic that makes the entire saga feel so intensely psychologically burdensome. In the end, a meticulously rehearsed display of unity for the flashing cameras tells us absolutely nothing about the suffocating, paranoid strain fracturing the foundation behind locked doors. Months down the line, long after law enforcement officially cleared the immediate relatives of any wrongdoing. On March 2nd, Savannah, Annie, and Tommaso walked side by side back to Nancy's residence, laying floral tributes at a makeshift vigil while begging the community to hold on to hope. On the surface, it paints a picture of unbreakable unity. Beneath that surface, however, lies something deeply brittle, a fractured bloodline desperately attempting to hold itself together while trapped within the epicenter of a chilling, meticulously targeted abduction. This profound psychological dissonance forms the very beating heart of this investigation. Outwardly, they present a united front. Yet, the forensic reality points to a predator with a specific agenda, while the emotional toll bleeds into their increasingly burdened rhetoric. Savannah refused to be silenced by the uncertainty. She relentlessly broadcasted the Federal Bureau of Investigation's hotline, ensuring the spotlight never drifted from her missing loved one. As agonizing weeks bled into one another, she fiercely spearheaded campaigns for a mounting financial bounty. But when a person is forced to narrate their own waking nightmare on a continuous loop, observant minds begin tuning into the subtle shifts in their voice. It is not about the literal words spoken, but the psychological drift beneath them. The initial cries are always about rescue. Eventually, those pleas morph into a desperate form of bargaining. Ultimately, the dialogue hardens into something devastating, a harrowing cocktail of fading optimism and cold resignation, where frantic urgency gives way to an unspeakable, creeping terror. By the waning days of February, news outlets confirmed that the privately funded reward pool had skyrocketed to an unprecedented sum. It was during this period that Savannah openly voiced the darkest scenario that Nancy might already be gone, even as she continued begging for her return. A shift of this magnitude does not necessarily imply she harbors secret truths. It does, however, confirm a grim reality. The psychological landscape for those trapped within the inner circle had fundamentally darkened. This very fracture is precisely what continually draws the public mind back to an incredibly disturbing hypothesis. It is not a matter of one sibling pointing a finger at another, but rather the crushing psychological weight of the ordeal, fracturing the way Savannah manages the narrative in front of the cameras. Paranoia, after all, does not always scream. Often, a lingering doubt operates in the absolute quiet. It manifests as a deliberate, heavy hesitation before speaking. It sounds like someone continuing to use the word "we," while their tone betrays a profound uncertainty about who that pronoun actually includes anymore. It looks exactly like a protective relative fiercely defending her kin on national television, while a quiet, internal realization dawns that the true answer lies far beyond the camera's gaze, which inevitably drags the spotlight back onto Tommaso. Not because he has ever been officially branded as the perpetrator, nor is he definitively implicated by evidence, but he represents the final verified crossing point between Nancy's mundane existence and the horrific abyss that swallowed her whole. Official records establish that Nancy shared a meal with both Annie and Tommaso right before Tommaso chauffeured her back to her residence on the night of January 31st. That specific vehicular drop-off serves as the ultimate, immovable cornerstone of the entire chronology. It is the core reason his name remains hopelessly entangled in the web of this mystery. This holds true regardless of detectives publicly clearing the blood relatives. A sequence of events does not simply vanish into thin air just because a key player has been legally absolved. The minutes and hours remain agonizingly rigid. They carry the exact same evidentiary gravity. Furthermore, if authorities are delving into shadowy co-conspirators, localized network outages, genetic markers, and a highly specific, calculated motive, then the final confirmed window of vulnerability remains critically vital, if only to map out the sheer depth of intelligence the predator possessed before striking. Consequently, what territory does this leave us standing in? We are stranded in the most frustrating void a true crime narrative can offer. Trapped inside an escalating, highly volatile investigation that is aggressively tightening behind closed doors, yet remains agonizingly opaque to the outside world. Investigators assert they have cracked the motive behind her abduction. Despite this confidence, they refuse to release a single name regarding the mastermind. Police command insists the inner circle is entirely innocent. However, the relatives are inextricably tethered to the trauma, primarily because the fatal countdown ultimately passes right through their hands. Law enforcement categorizes the hit as incredibly precise, transforming the question of who leaked the routine into something far more dangerous than simply uncovering the attacker's identity. Perhaps that psychological labyrinth is exactly why observers are so violently drawn into the undertow of this tragedy. It is not born from any tangible proof of familial guilt, but rather the sheer mechanics of the crime, forcing a singular, terrifying hypothesis back to the surface. What if the true phantom was never the masked figure breaking down the door, but the invisible architect who handed him the perfect chronological blueprint to execute the crime? It is this exact, haunting premise that prevents Nancy Guthrie's vanishing from ever feeling like a neatly tied-off tragedy. The disguise merely provides a face for the nightmare, while the meticulous clockwork of that evening leaves a gaping, unanswered psychological wound. The inner circle, despite being legally exonerated, fiercely guarded by public relations, and presenting a flawless united front, still represents the exact threshold where Nancy's mundane reality died and the horrific, unsolved saga was birthed. Therefore, as we delve deeper, latch onto that unsettling detail. Treat it not as an accusation, but as an undeniable point of friction, because the impending chapter is not about unearthing a magical, overnight resolution. It requires us to dwell in the uncomfortable, shadowy chasm that lies squarely between the guarded secrets of the detectives and the sanitized narrative fed to the masses. Within that very silence, we might just find the most explosive revelations of the entire ordeal. The reality of law enforcement is clear. The moment detectives stand before microphones and broadcast their absolute certainty regarding a perpetrator's motive, yet simultaneously withhold the culprit's identity or the intricate mechanics of how the snare was laid, It overwhelmingly signals that they are fiercely shielding a working theory, one too volatile to survive the glare of public scrutiny just yet. Fast forward to March 13th, 2026. Sheriff Chris Nanos has officially placed his chips on the table, declaring unequivocally that the hunter who took Nancy Guthrie knew exactly who he was looking for. Detectives are convinced they possess the underlying motive, quietly chasing down viable leads without ever uttering a suspect's name to the press. That calculated silence speaks volumes. This investigation is not lost in an abyss of complete mystery. Rather, it lingers in the agonizing purgatory of partial comprehension. And that fragmented truth is precisely where the psychological torment for the victim's loved ones truly begins, taking root the moment police clearly hold back deeply guarded secrets. Anyone trapped within the victim's inner circle is suddenly thrust into a suffocating, invisible pressure cooker, forced to stand before the cameras and echo the standard pleas for help. In the unforgiving glare of the media, they maintain a highly curated composure, terrified of slipping up and uttering a single syllable that might derail the ongoing manhunt. Behind closed doors, however, they are reduced to obsessively parsing the detective's tones, the pregnant pauses, the glaring omissions, and the subtle pivots in investigative strategy. The atmosphere shifts drastically when interrogators abandon wide-net inquiries in favor of pinpoint, laser-focused interrogations, a reality that makes Savannah's time in the spotlight feel unbearably weighted. She was never merely broadcasting pleas into an empty abyss. Rather, she was navigating a microphone while the very foundation of her mother's vanishing mutated daily beneath her feet. During those frantic initial days, the family's broadcasts were entirely anchored in a desperate rescue mission, a narrative abruptly hijacked by the arrival of a chilling, ransom-like correspondence. Soon followed the sudden escalation of the reward money, bleeding inevitably into the harrowing press conference where Savannah openly confronted the grim possibility that her mother was already dead. Even as she desperately clung to a fragile illusion of hope, the tragic metamorphosis of her mindset was permanently etched into the media archives. It serves as a stark mirror to an investigation that was unraveling psychologically by the hour. But let us stop and examine that for a moment. Because this juncture marks the exact threshold where the narrative ceases to be a singular tragedy and transforms into a dark, sequential psychological descent. Initially, the frantic relatives operate strictly on the primal urge to retrieve their loved one, before pivoting to a desperate attempt to open a dialogue with the unseen abductor. When those efforts fail and the trail grows frustratingly cold, a far more sinister reality begins to seep into the household. They are forced to mentally endure the horrific scenarios the authorities likely already believe to be true, yet cannot legally articulate to the press. That shadowy, isolating purgatory appears to be the exact psychological terrain Savannah was forced to navigate, a realm devoid of concrete indictments or loud accusations. Instead, it was the voice of a grieving child speaking from the epicenter of a mystery that had long shed the comforting illusion of a random, stranger-driven abduction. The moment law enforcement deliberately uses words like targeted and motive, while quietly processing complex genetic profiles behind the scenes, and diving into the shadowy potential of co-conspirators or localized broadband blackouts, the entire hunt adopts a chilling, hyper-strategic methodology. Paradoxically, it also becomes deeply intimate, which perfectly explains why the victim's innermost circle of access remains permanently tethered to the investigation's core. Even when authorities officially clear relatives of direct involvement, the documented evidence trail leaves absolutely no room for ambiguity. Detectives ruthlessly dissect their private lives, tearing through their residences, tearing apart their automobiles, and extracting every byte of data from their digital devices before granting that public exoneration. Looking at it through a purely structural lens, the relatives find themselves existing in a paradoxical state, formally removed from the suspect list, yet forever imprisoned within the most critical chronological window of the entire crime, a dichotomy that is utterly soul-crushing. Consider the intense psychological toll of that reality. You hold a piece of paper declaring your innocence, yet the victim's final, breathing moments are inextricably woven into your own actions. The badge of suspicion has been removed, but the blood-soaked timeline intersects directly with your evening meal. It intertwines with your vehicle drop-offs, your casual dialogue, your location pings, your cellular data, and your front door, which, while not equating to culpability, undeniably breeds an agonizing, unspoken friction. And that precise, vibrating anxiety is exactly what audiences have been detecting beneath Savannah's televised pleas, whether they consciously recognized it or not. Here, the narrative thread involving Annie adopts a far more sinister resonance, though certainly not because there is any definitive evidence linking her to a felonious act. No such proof exists. However, Annie's placement in the saga is a psychological anchor that the public simply cannot disregard, as she is far from some estranged, peripheral cousin. She never wandered into the aftermath as an afterthought. She was a fixture in that ultimate, intimate ring of trust, front and center during the initial, tearful pressers. She belonged to the unified front facing the lenses, woven into the very household that triggered intense law enforcement scrutiny long before the sheriff's department officially walked back the familial accusations. Consequently, the overarching, dark inquiry hanging over this case refuses to die quietly. What could possibly make Savannah appear? In fleeting instances, as though her underlying terror was slowly pivoting toward her own inner circle. Not because she ever openly confessed it, but because the sheer anatomical makeup of the investigation continuously drags that horrifying theory back to the table, where the phantom masked figure provides the convenient illusion of an outside invader. Meanwhile, the familial chronology paints a vivid picture of unfettered access, and the lead detective's assertions of a directed strike clearly establish premeditated intent. The deafening silence from the precinct hints at a massive trove of buried secrets, while Savannah's mutating vocabulary serves as the raw, psychological proof that Nancy's most intimate confidants were likely wrestling with a labyrinth of grim realities far beyond what the evening news was permitted to broadcast. This identical dynamic is precisely why Tommaso's shadow continues to loom so heavily over the narrative. Again, absolutely not as an indicted perpetrator, but rather as the final, mundane anchor point standing just inches from the precipice before the timeline plummets into utter horror. Media documentation consistently verifies that Nancy broke bread with Annie and Tommaso, with Tommaso subsequently chauffeuring her back just as the window of normalcy slammed shut forever, seconds before she vanished into the ether of an abduction that investigators now chillingly classify as a deliberate, homicidal hunt. That specific chronological intersection remains agonizingly crucial. Even if isolated, it equates to zero legal guilt. Yet, assuming the predator's execution was flawless, if the ambush was surgically precise, and if detectives are indeed still hunting down localized signal jamming, genetic trace elements, and the dark web of co-conspirator involvement, it leaves us grappling with a chilling question. Was the figure caught on camera merely the final link in a much darker, highly coordinated chain of intelligence? This is the most terrifying lens through which to view the investigation. It goes far beyond the simple fact of an intruder breaching Nancy's sanctuary. It introduces the sinister possibility that this phantom arrived armed with precise, lethal knowledge, striking the exact window, targeting the exact woman on the perfect night, exploiting the ultimate vulnerability. This is precisely why we must continually return to the unsaid. We must obsess over the specific phrasing used, the calculated silences, and the meticulous sequencing of events. In a landscape where the official narrative is deliberately fractured, those empty spaces are where the mounting, crushing tension begins to echo aloud. It is within these shadows that a family's shifting demeanor reveals the agonizing truth of just how suffocating the investigation has grown away from the media's glare. Consider this chilling thought as we venture deeper into the mystery. If detectives genuinely understand the underlying motive behind Nancy's abduction, yet stubbornly refuse to unveil the complete framework of their theory to the world, then who among the key players is already suffocating beneath the immense, silent gravity of that concealed truth? We have reached a point where the core of this tragedy transcends a simple police procedural. It becomes a psychological study of a family deteriorating in real time, trapped in a purgatory where the answers are agonizingly close, yet remain cloaked in shadows. That agonizing void between knowing and proving might just hold the master key to this entire enigma. Think about it. When law enforcement openly hints that they have deciphered the motive but adamantly refuse to name the predator or outline the exact sequence of the crime, it is almost always a sign that they are guarding a delicate, explosive working hypothesis that could shatter if exposed too soon. Fast forward to March 13th, 2026. Sheriff Chris Nano steps before the microphones and delivers a bombshell. Detectives are convinced Nancy Guthrie was hunted down on purpose. Authorities signal that they grasp the dark reasoning behind her vanishing, quietly pursuing fierce leads without ever whispering a suspect's name into the public record. This subtle admission is profoundly revealing. Law enforcement is no longer wandering blindly through a cold, featureless fog. They are operating within a realm of fragmented truth. And it is exactly this half-lit space of partial knowledge that inflicts the most excruciating torment upon those left behind. The moment detectives broadcast that they hold secrets they cannot share, an invisible, crushing pressure chamber seals itself around everyone connected to the victim. On camera, they maintain their composure, delivering desperate pleas and navigating interviews with terrifying caution. Out in the open, they walk a razor-thin wire, terrified of uttering a single syllable that might compromise the hunt for the perpetrator. But behind locked doors, they are reduced to obsessively decoding the detective's subtle tone shifts, the jarring silences, and that chilling pivot when police abandon generic inquiries to drill into hyper-specific, terrifying details. This psychological gauntlet is precisely why Savannah's role as the public face of the family carries such a deeply unsettling, gravitational weight. She was never merely shouting into the abyss. She was being forced to narrate a nightmare while the foundational facts of the investigation violently shifted beneath her feet. Trace the timeline. Their initial pleas were frantic, built entirely around a desperate rescue mission. Then, the atmosphere morphed with the sudden arrival of ransom-esque demands. Next came the sudden escalation of the bounty. And finally, that devastating juncture where a daughter had to look into a lens and verbally confront the very real possibility of her mother's death, while stubbornly clinging to the final shreds of hope. This dark evolution is permanently etched into the media archives, holding up a mirror to a mystery that was mutating emotionally by the hour. Let us freeze that frame for a moment. We are crossing the threshold where the narrative shifts from a singular tragic night to a brutal, escalating sequence of psychological trauma. In the terrifying initial hours, a family's singular, primal focus is simply dragging their loved one back through the front door. Days later, that focus twists into a desperate attempt to open a dialogue with the unseen monster who snatched her in the dark. But when the silence stretches on, or the evidence turns grim, they are forced to simply endure the horrifying scenarios that detectives secretly believe but cannot yet prove in a court of law. That claustrophobic, agonizing purgatory appears to be the exact psychological landscape Savannah was forced to navigate on a daily basis. We are not talking about concrete suspicions or loud indictments. We are witnessing a daughter trapped inside an investigation that had shed any illusion of being a random, wrong place, wrong time tragedy. The instant investigators drop words like targeted, the moment they introduce the concept of motive, and as they relentlessly pursue genetic evidence, whisper about potential co-conspirators, and dig into highly sophisticated anomalies like a sudden, localized blackout of the neighborhood's internet, the hunt simultaneously transforms into something brilliantly calculated and terrifyingly personal. It perfectly explains why the tightest ring of people who had access to Nancy's inner life can never fully escape the gravitational pull of the investigation. Yes, loved ones may have been officially cleared of suspicion in the press. Yet, a closer look at the record confirms that authorities tore through their lives with a fine-toothed comb. Detectives dismantled their residences, swept their cars, cloned their devices, and scrutinized every digital footprint before granting them that clearance. From a purely analytical perspective, this creates a deeply haunting paradox. The family is formally excluded as suspects, yet forever imprisoned within the most critical sequence of hours the detectives possess. The psychological toll of this duality is absolutely ruinous. Just try to fathom the mental anguish of living in that space. Your name is cleared, but the victim's final, fleeting moments on Earth are inextricably tethered to your actions. You are innocent in the eyes of the law, Yet the ultimate damning timeline intersects violently with your quiet dinner, your routine goodbye, your casual phone calls, your digital history, and the sanctity of your own home. Being present does not equate to being guilty. However, it breeds an unbearable, suffocating strain. And that raw, vibrating anxiety is precisely what has been trembling beneath every word Savannah has spoken, whether the audience caught the frequency or not. Which leads us directly to Annie, and the moment this dark tapestry takes on an entirely new, deeply unsettling shade. It isn't that there is any tangible, public evidence tying Annie to a criminal act. There simply isn't. Rather, she exists in a psychological space within this narrative that viewers inherently cannot look away from. We are not talking about some estranged cousin, nor is she a peripheral character who merely wandered into the investigation after the fact. She remains firmly anchored within that ultimate inner circle of the family, standing right at the forefront during those desperate initial pleas to the media. She was an integral piece of the emotional united front presented on camera, rooted in a household that naturally attracted the intense, early gaze of investigators long before law enforcement publicly redirected the scrutiny away from the family. That underlying tension is exactly why the central question of this mystery refuses to simply fade away. What could possibly explain those fleeting moments where Savannah's terror appeared to shift its focus, aiming directly back at her own inner circle? She never articulated this dread out loud, yet the very architecture of this investigation continuously forces that dark, unsettling possibility into the spotlight. A masked figure introduces the theory of a violent home invasion. The domestic timeline establishes a window of vulnerability. Meanwhile, the sheriff's explicit remarks regarding a targeted attack provide the chilling element of intent. Then, the deafening silence from law enforcement offers up a void of carefully concealed context. Finally, the subtle shifts in Savannah's own words serve as a psychological barometer, hinting that those closest to Nancy were burdened by a far darker, more labyrinthine reality than what was presented to the watching world. This exact same psychological friction is precisely what anchors Tommaso so permanently within the framework of this grim narrative. To be clear, he has never been officially branded as a suspect, but he stands as the final, mundane bridge connecting Nancy's ordinary life to the impending nightmare. Media accounts have repeatedly highlighted that final dinner shared with Annie and Tommaso, followed by his drive bringing her back, positioning him at the absolute precipice of her vanishing point. Within an investigation that police now classify as a highly calculated strike, such chronological proximity carries a heavy, inescapable significance, regardless of whether it holds independent evidentiary value. Furthermore, if the perpetrator's execution was truly as flawless as it appears, if their infiltration was meticulously mapped out, and if detectives are indeed still untangling the threads of compromised security technology, combined with the lingering questions of genetic material and the dark geometry of potential accomplices, the public is left grappling with one terrifying thought. Could that phantom intruder have merely been the physical manifestation of a much deeper, more insidious network of shared intelligence? That is the most horrifying iteration of this mystery. It goes beyond a stranger breaching Nancy's sanctuary. It suggests an assailant armed with lethal, hyper-specific knowledge, perfectly calibrated to exploit the correct hour, the precise target, the ideal evening, and her ultimate vulnerability. That chilling realization is why our exploration relentlessly returns to the trinity of spoken statements, deliberate omissions, and chronological precision. When the official narrative is heavily redacted, those three elements become the exact fractures where the true underlying tension begins to scream. It is in these microscopic details that a grieving family's physical and linguistic demeanor reveals the crushing, unseen weight of the reality unfolding out of the public eye. Therefore, allow me to pose a critical question as we venture deeper into the dark. Assuming that detectives have truly unlocked the underlying motive for Nancy's abduction, yet fiercely refuse to unveil the complex architecture of that theory to the masses, we must ask, which figures within this tragedy are already suffocating under the burden of that concealed truth? The subsequent chapter of this descent is no longer confined strictly to the parameters of a police procedural. It becomes a profound psychological study of a family unraveling as the absolute truth inches terrifyingly close, yet stubbornly refuses to step out of the shadows. At this critical juncture, The narrative trajectory was completely hijacked, driven not by open-source facts, but by the phantom knowledge detectives hoarded in silence. That agonizing liminal space is precisely where surviving this kind of waking nightmare becomes entirely suffocating for those trapped within its borders. There is a vast psychological chasm between a case that has gone cold and one that is tightly contained. A cold investigation is defined by its hollow emptiness. Conversely, a contained investigation feels claustrophobic heavy with suppressed evidence, silent hypotheses, and a looming reality vibrating just inches outside the public's peripheral vision. That dense, oppressive atmosphere is exactly what this inquiry radiates today. Sheriff Chris Nanos has explicitly stated that his team views Nancy as a specific mark, claiming they grasp the underlying motive and are relentlessly hunting down threads, all while keeping the perpetrator's identity a closely guarded secret. He further revealed that a complex genetic profile recovered from the crime scene remains under the microscope a ticking time bomb of potential revelation. Strip away the cinematic dramatization and consider the visceral reality of what that inflicts upon her loved ones. It transforms every single moment in front of a lens into a psychological tightrope walk. Every syllable uttered must simultaneously appease a ravenous public hunting for morbid breadcrumbs, while carefully avoiding the wrath of detectives desperate to protect the integrity of their hunt. Consequently, manufacturing the illusion of optimism becomes agonizing, as hope mutates from a pure emotional reflex into something deeply calculated. It transforms into a mere tactic. Her relatives continue pleading for tips, continuously amplifying the financial bounty, and begging the shadows to speak. They do this even while the lexicon utilized by law enforcement has steadily descended into a much bleaker, far more predatory focus. The Federal Bureau's bounty currently sits on the record at a staggering $100,000. Simultaneously, the family's private, desperate crusade has amassed an astronomical reported sum of $1 million. This psychological crucible is exactly why Savannah continues to serve as the beating, traumatized heart of this mystery. She holds neither a badge nor the title of the accused. She provides no forensic smoking gun, yet she remains the singular human conduit through which the outside world can tangibly feel the shifting, tempestuous climate of this tragedy. And that climate has grown frigid. The initial cries for help carried the frantic energy of a rescue mission, which slowly decayed into the desperate tone of a hostage negotiation. Eventually, those pleas morphed into something far more devastating, the sound of a daughter fiercely gripping onto a fading light while quietly preparing a dark, empty space for a mother who is never coming home. This subtle tonal deviation precisely explains why audiences initially began scrutinizing every statement Savannah released. Yet, this is the exact juncture where the narrative plunges into profound darkness. Once law enforcement officially classified the act as a calculated strike, the mystery evolved far beyond the perpetrator's identity. The chilling inquiry became, what intelligence was gathered beforehand? Instantly, the microscopic focus violently snaps back to Nancy's intimate inner orbit. This occurs not because concrete evidence implicates her blood relatives, but simply because premeditated hits require inside intelligence. The architect of this act understood the victim intimately, mapping her daily patterns and pinpointing her deepest vulnerabilities. An unseen watcher identified the perfect temporal window to strike. This chilling reality explains the exhaustive forensic sweep of familial residences, automobiles, and digital devices before detectives cleared them. Grasping that psychological dynamic illuminates the heavy atmosphere lingering over Annie and Tommaso, serving not as proof of guilt, but as an agonizing investigative pressure point. Tommaso remains forever tethered to the final documented hours of normalcy before Nancy's world descended into chaos. The shared meal, the transit back, the parting of ways, these moments constituted the ultimate transition into fatal exposure. Annie likewise stays inextricably linked to that critical access window, anchoring the initial desperate appeals and residing within the home that attracted intense armchair sleuthing. Yet, even with her inner circle officially exonerated, the cold chronology of that evening cannot simply be erased. These temporal anchors form the structural skeleton of the entire investigation, proving exactly why the terrifying porch footage falls short. Initially, that disguise appeared to encompass the entire enigma, Looking closely now, it functions merely as the jagged perimeter of a massive conspiracy. If detectives are actively pursuing coordinated conspirators and investigating mysterious local connectivity blackouts during her vanishing, the nightmare's true scope eclipses a single security frame. Such details point toward an operation requiring meticulous orchestration, sophisticated digital savvy, and tactical synchronization transcending the lone phantom documented on the doorstep. This inevitably drags our attention back to the most terrifying, unspoken query echoing through this psychological labyrinth. What if the profound terror paralyzing Savannah had absolutely nothing to do with a random stranger lurking in the dark? What if a creeping dread materialized from realizing the fatal intelligence leak originated from a source uncomfortably close to the victim's sanctuary? This hypothesis does not automatically condemn Annie as complicit, nor does it inherently implicate Tommaso. It avoids branding the broader family as clandestine conspirators, but brutally forces a deeply unsettling scenario back to the investigative forefront. The predator clearly operated on highly specific intelligence, and the victim's closest confidants inadvertently stand at the absolute nexus where that crucial data flowed. Perhaps this lingering phantom connection explains why the investigation perpetually radiates an aura of agonizing incompletion, despite a steady drip of official updates, simply because the police have never once claimed to be completely blind. Instead, their rhetoric is far more disturbing. They hold fractured fragments of truth and maintain a firm belief in an underlying catalyst. Detectives remain convinced the victim was hunted with purpose, continuing to meticulously process genetic material while broadcasting grim warnings about the perpetrator's ongoing threat. Yet, authorities fiercely guard their overarching blueprint, maintaining a deafening quiet that inevitably tears a grieving family apart. It sentences loved ones to mourn within a suffocating void, though this is far from an innocent lack of knowledge. The trauma is magnified by the haunting intuition that a concrete narrative exists, a horrific reality detectives comprehend with terrifying clarity. It forms an invisible architecture of guilt that outside observers sense instinctively without tracing its exact outlines. Trapped inside such a claustrophobic psychological pressure cooker, human behavior begins to warp. Speech patterns shift, silences lengthen, and unbreakable bonds silently fracture. These cracks rarely manifest as explosive confrontations, emerging instead as a creeping rot of hypervigilance and a curated composure barely masking unadulterated terror. This profound, lingering unease is the true legacy etched into the very fabric of the investigation. We are left not with a neatly packaged resolution, but a suffocating tension, a gnawing suspicion that authorities are harboring the singular keystone required to bridge these bloody fragments. Until that hidden truth is unearthed, the most agonizing element of the Nancy Guthrie tragedy might never be the haunting silhouette on the surveillance feed. The ultimate nightmare is the overwhelming likelihood that the unvarnished reality has already crystallized within the secure confines of the precinct walls. All the while, grieving relatives and civilian sleuths remain paralyzed, forced to decipher shifting silhouettes of alibis, unexplainable quietness, and testimonies that morphed for a deliberate, concealed purpose. Now, the entire ordeal hardens into its most punishing phase yet. This bleak evolution is not born from a sudden wave of collective clarity regarding the crime. Rather, the masses possess just enough fragmented data to realize the preliminary breadcrumbs were fundamentally incapable of solving the puzzle. Consider the discarded handwear. For a fleeting period, they manifested as the elusive smoking gun, especially after search teams located dark mittens roughly 2 miles away. The garments bore an undeniable resemblance to the tactical gear donned by the shadowy intruder stalking the front porch. However, as early March arrived, forensics delivered a crushing blow. Extracted genetic material belonged merely to a local culinary employee, completely disconnected from the atrocity. Additional biological traces recovered from the scene remain under the microscope of forensic experts. And this lingering analysis carries a twofold weight. Primarily, it lays bare just how profoundly deceptive this entire investigation has proven to be from the very first hour. The most cinematic pieces of evidence, the ones that commanded public fascination, have stubbornly refused to lead down the paths we all anticipated. Furthermore, it forcibly pulls the narrative back toward that same chilling conclusion that has been hovering like a shadow over this investigation from the start. We are no longer waiting for a single smoking gun, a carelessly discarded item, a fleeting frame of surveillance video, or a momentary slip-up. If closure ever arrives in the public eye, it will demand something far more complex. It will require painstakingly rebuilding a shattered timeline, layering intent, pinpointing access, analyzing digital interference, tracking physical movements, and unearthing the invisible thread that detectives are convinced binds this entire nightmare together. It is precisely this labyrinth of evidence that makes the suffocating silence emanating from the authorities feel so incredibly ominous. Yet, Sheriff Chris Nanos does not present as a man fumbling in the dark. His rhetoric is measured, calculated, the careful cadence of an investigator ferociously guarding a tightly held theory. He has stated with unsettling conviction that Nancy was explicitly hunted, and more importantly, that law enforcement comprehends the exact motivation behind it. Detectives are actively hunting for potential co-conspirators, all while attempting to untangle complex, mixed genetic profiles left behind in the aftermath. Simultaneously, the identity of the perpetrator remains cloaked in secrecy, leaving the mystery agonizingly open well past the 6-week mark since Nancy was swallowed by the night. Such a paradox inflicts a distinct kind of psychological torture upon her blood relatives, suggesting the walls are closing in on the truth, even as it remains utterly invisible to them. Detectives might already be tracing the silhouette of the orchestrator, while those who loved Nancy most are left suffocating in the emotional wreckage of not knowing the monster's name. Under that immense weight, the interpersonal dynamics orbiting the investigation begin to warp, becoming incredibly difficult for outsiders to accurately decipher. The outward displays of familial solidarity might be entirely genuine. The collective agony broadcast to the world is undoubtedly authentic. However, lurking just beneath that fragile surface, a different, more insidious current begins to pull the agonizing, suffocating pressure of knowing only half the story. Consequently, our narrative inevitably spirals back to Savannah. It is not that she has unlocked the mystery, but rather that her public evolution serves as the most striking emotional barometer for the investigation's shifting tides. We watched her family's desperate broadcasts mutate from frantic, breathless cries for a safe return to calculated responses meant for kidnappers, and eventually settling into an excruciating purgatory suspended between fading optimism and looming grief. The financial bounty for her safe return skyrocketed into the stratosphere, even as Savannah stood before the cameras, relentlessly pleading with the shadows to surrender their secrets. These shifts are far more than mere press briefings. They are psychological milestones, illuminating how Nancy's inner circle was being forced to recalibrate to a reality that was rapidly losing its light. As the days bled away, the tragedy hardened, morphing into something fiercely tactical and terrifyingly intimate. This deeply rooted intimacy is exactly why the narrative thread tethered to her sister simply refuses to vanish into the background. Let us state this unequivocally. There is absolutely zero public documentation suggesting Annie possessed any foreknowledge of a criminal act. Law enforcement officials have explicitly stated that the immediate family was cleared, their innocence verified only after forensic teams tore through residences, vehicles, digital devices, and private communications. Yet, being legally absolved does not erase one's fingerprints from the emotional architecture of a tragedy. Annie stands eternally frozen within the innermost sanctuary of the victim's life. She remains a vital component of those frantic early broadcasts, anchored forever to the final, mundane hours of Nancy's existence, a timeline detectives had to dissect under a microscope before hunting in darker territories. The identical psychological weight firmly attaches itself to the public perception of Tommaso. The details that thrust him into the blistering spotlight were never inherently tied to guilt or suspicion. They were, instead, entirely dictated by physical proximity. He represents the final confirmed chapter of her evening, recognized as the individual who navigated her back to her doorstep mere moments before the narrative descended into absolute obscurity. When dissecting a meticulously planned vanishing, that ultimate corridor of access becomes the most critical piece of the puzzle. It acts as the key to understanding the predator's surveillance, what they observed, exactly when they absorbed that intelligence, and how they exploited a fleeting window of opportunity. Consequently, after sifting through the wreckage of the past weeks, the investigation has shattered into something far more intricate than a single, easily digestible question. In the genesis of the terror, the puzzle was purely visual. What was the identity of the phantom beneath the mask? Today, the horror is profoundly structural, whose invisible hand possessed the intimate knowledge required to execute that flawless strike. That psychological shift is the true metamorphosis this saga has undergone before the eyes of a watching world. The chilling still frame that originally burned itself into the public consciousness remains. Yet, it no longer exists in a vacuum. It is now flanked by sinister revelations that knot the narrative into something infinitely more twisted. Law enforcement operates on the chilling certainty that this was an assassination of normalcy, a deliberate targeting, and they firmly believe they hold the twisted reasoning behind it. They are actively peeling back the layers of potential conspirators, even as once promising avenues like the theatrical discovery of a discarded glove dissolve into dead ends. Meanwhile, those standing at the epicenter of her final timeline have been thoroughly vetted and legally cleared. Yet they remain permanently chained to the nightmare, their memories acting as the final bridge back to the life Nancy once lived. And that precarious precipice is exactly where this documentary finally leaves us. We are not granted the comfort of a gavel drop, nor the relief of a neatly tied conclusion, but are instead abandoned with an inquiry far more terrifying than the one that drew us in. Perhaps the most bone-chilling facet of Nancy Guthrie being swallowed by the darkness was never simply the arrival of a faceless predator on her porch. The true horror might be that the moment detectives reclassified this as a calculated hunt, the nature of the beast fundamentally mutated. The obsession shifted away from the physical intruder captured in the lens, pivoting entirely toward the invisible architect who handed them the blueprint. We are left wondering who harbored such dangerous intelligence, how those secrets were transmitted, and if the individuals wrapped tightest around Nancy felt the temperature drop long before the rest of the world even knew she was gone. The void left by Nancy remains entirely unfilled, and to this hour, the ghost responsible has neither a face nor a name. To this day, the authorized narrative remains severely fractured. Until those gaps close, this investigation emanates profoundly lingering dread. While that physical disguise undeniably obscured an identity, the absolute darkest truth remained quietly buried within the chronology all along.